also lovers of timber construction, and we want to see as much timber construction as we can. But that's partly why we think the secondary timber, the stuff that's already in the building stock but is coming out and not being very well used, should add to the amount of bio-based construction we can do, because the more of that timber source we have, the more concrete and steel we can displace.
Did you know that you can use reclaimed wood to make cross-laminated timber? Well, today I caught up with Colin, Juliet, and Jonas, the team behind UK CLT, to learn how they're doing it. I asked them why they're making it, how it compares to primary CLT, and what they see as the best use cases for cross-laminated secondary timber. They unpacked how it's made, the testing behind it, and the broader implications for circular, sustainable businesses just like them. But before we jump in, the Mass Timber Group Summit is scheduled for August 2025. We're bringing the mass timber community together to connect with the latest trends, expert advice from industry leaders, and future project teams. Tickets and the call for speakers will be live soon. Go to masstimber.group to get on the waitlist so you don't miss out. So with that, let's get into it.
The UK uses quite a lot of mass timber in construction, but we have next to no homegrown production of CLT, or some glulam, but even then the timber is generally imported from elsewhere in Europe. We do have is a whole load of waste timber that's generally being discarded, downcycled. And so what we're looking at is the opportunity to shortcut that system of waste management. And instead of ending up with MDF, chipboards, or just incinerating the material straight away, we're looking at trying to get that in as a feedstock for mass timber.
How did you guys get started? Like, what kicked you off down this journey? It's not like every day somebody just says, hey, I'm going to take reclaimed materials and turn it into cross-laminated timber.
Shall I take that? I'm a professor of environmental engineering at UCL, and Colin approached us in relation to a scholarship that we were offering to do a PhD. And he came and said he wanted to study reuse of building components. And so we talked, there was a lot of background work, several years, in fact, of PhD study before Colin hit upon the idea of looking at reuse of timber. And in fact, I spent a long time trying to convince him that he should be doing reuse of concrete, which I still regret whether we never did that, but there are other people doing that now.
And so through that conversation, I'm assuming, Colin, you did a little bit of studying on it. Then how did it come into reality? How did it go from idea to action?
Well, yeah, I was trying to get to reuse in general. I was trying to look at the systems for how a city can enable more reuse of the stuff that's currently being discarded. And so there was this sort of more ephemeral way of looking at that at system level, which actually became less ephemeral with time, became a bit more sort of policy focused and infrastructure to support that kind of circular construction. But what was really helpful alongside that was to have something that was really practical and tangible. So the timber started out as a case study. Can we take some timber? And in the very first one, it was some floorboards in a building that my industrial sponsors for the PhD were going to be demolishing. And we did the whole process of reclaiming those floorboards, moving them to a place where we could process them, denailing, planing down, getting to the right dimensions, jointing, and then making a three lamella pair of boards that acted as a tabletop for a co-working space that they were also developing. So it was a kind of very first prototype, and something that meant we could look at how the sort of urban systems and the product level systems supported one another.
I'm really curious on the sustainability aspect, or unpacking that a little bit. And so a lot of people turn to cross-laminated timber or mass timber products in general, at least in the entry stage, because they're interested in like, hey, how do we use better materials, more renewable materials? And when you're looking at, replacing concrete or steel members with timber components, people already say, hey, that's a win. What made you want to go like one step further and reclaim timber that's already been done, like specifically for the UK and where you're at?
I mean, yeah, we're also lovers of timber construction, and we want to see as much timber construction as we can. But that's partly why we think the secondary timber, the stuff that's already in the building stock but is coming out and not being very well used, should add to the amount of bio-based construction we can do, because the more of that timber source we have, the more concrete and steel we can displace. And I think if you're looking at reuse in general, like we want to see, it's great London's seeing a lot of reuse of steel now, which wasn't happening a few years ago. But reuse of timber also means we're extending that carbon sequestration over another whole life cycle of a building if it's in the structure. So again, to compare to what's happening at the moment with wood waste, if it goes into MDF and then the MDF gets used once, then gets incinerated, maybe that gives you another 10 years of the fiber being in physical use. But if we can use it within CLT and glulam, then 60 years, 120 years, who knows?
Yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about very much so far is circular economy. And I think it's important to say that this work is being conducted in the context of a UCL hub for research and education in circular economy, UCL Circle, the Circular Economy Lab. And I guess the primary definition of the circular economy is cycling of materials at their highest value, which is a way of making the most of the materials that we extract from the earth. And I think that is really one of the underlying things in using secondary timber rather than primary timber, or in addition to primary timber, I should maybe say, because in the circular economy we have cycling of material, of what we call technical materials, which are things that go in sort of an endless loop. But then we also have biological renewable materials, which cascade back down essentially to soil, usually in some way. And it just makes sense to get the most value out of them once we've extracted them, to keep them in circulation. And in fact, we just think mass timber is a brilliant way to do that, because you can take timber that in fact was used at a fairly low value and you're actually upcycling it, and then upcycling it in a way that probably allows it to be reused in some form, even at the end of service life of a piece of cross-laminated secondary timber. It can probably be used again before it goes down that pathway of being chipped or burned or whatever.
I love that. And I've heard this from a bunch of different folks that I've talked to in the UK, but also you guys don't have the same raw material fiber basket that other parts of the world do. So it's like you don't have, millions upon tens of millions of softwood lumber growing in the UK. And so it's also like you have this resource, it's not being put to its highest and best use. This thing called mass timber is gaining in popularity and adoption. So it's like, how do you use what you have to participate in that part of the industry? Is that also a focus?
Most definitely, yeah. I think also from the point of view of encouraging development of UK industry in this area, not just of recovered timber, but of recovery of secondary materials, because we import a lot of stuff at great expense, and then if it just gets exported again as waste, we're really not getting the most out of it that we can be, also in terms of our economy and labor force and so on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The UK is also not alone in that respect. Like I think Denmark, Netherlands, there's a few densely populated Western European countries where there isn't much forestry, and yet timber waste is pretty much ubiquitous.
Yeah. I have a question for Jonas. Is there any difference in working with reclaimed CLT products from a carpenter's construction point of view than using a virgin CLT panel, if you will?
I would say from a kind of mechanical perspective, not at all. And looking at the latest publication of Colin, Julia, and Wenchen, they kind of assessed from a structural perspective and showcased that there is no kind of, there's a high indication that the structural values are very much the same, if not even better. I mean, to be assessed probably. But from a manufacturing perspective, no difference. And from a kind of handling perspective, no difference, no.
And so the paper that you just referenced, did I hear that Colin and Julia and one other person were a part of putting that together? Can you unpack that a little bit for me? Because I think one of the questions that came to my mind is, you kind of answered, is like, what are the structural application differences for using reclaimed CLT versus that virgin stuff? Can you explain that for me a little bit?
I mean, the challenge, let's say, I mean, we know that when you have an old piece of timber, if it's not rotten or has a lot of drill holes or whatever, it's still fine. The strength remains the same if it's kind of stored dry and can stay a long time. We have wonderful examples of houses in the Swiss Alps, for example, surely in other countries as well, which are like 400 years old, made from timber almost entirely. So it's not necessarily the timber in itself which loses its value. That means even if you then put it together to a product, even then it stays pretty good. The challenge for us, and I think the challenge a bit for everyone who works with reclaimed timber, is the strength grading, or the kind of assessment of strength. And that's currently kind of about to be solved by some standards being published, or initial draft standards being published, that allow us to structurally grade the parts before then kind of laminating it to panel. But that's not yet completely solved, which means there is basically some work to be done on this hand.
Can I get a copy of that paper and link it for people to read? Is that something we can do?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah, I'd love to just read it myself, but also to share it with other people. When you're talking about taking these reclaimed wood members, is it primarily like plank style boards, or are you reclaiming or in a certain dimension, if you will, like, hey, we're looking for 2x8, 3x8, like whatever, and then also like species. So like, tell me like what size of members you guys are reclaiming, but also is there like a species limitation?
Species limitation only, that we're focusing on softwood rather than hardwood. Dimensionally, we're the smaller they come, there's a sweet spot, of course. We had some that were so big that they wouldn't go through the metal detector aperture, but anything pretty much over 1.5 inches by 3 inches.
And what about length? Are you guys finger jointing?
We're finger jointing, so yeah. Again, longer the better, but
sure.
I think there's it kind of makes sense to put things straight back into reuse. If you don't have to go through the process of turning something into CLT, if you can just directly reuse members as they come, then do that. We're not trying to take away from the existing salvage industry. The issue tends to be that in demolition things do get shorter, whether that's just by cutting off the ends, or because it's easier for them to handle if they cut it in half and take bits out of the building in sort of 2 meter lengths instead of 4. And so that's fine. We can work with shorter lengths, whereas to directly reuse that stuff would be pretty difficult.
So recognizing that you're not trying to make CLT just for the purpose of making CLT for these reclaimed materials that are coming out, because they can be used in other applications. What applications specifically are you guys thinking that reclaimed CLT is a perfect fit?
I think there's loads of opportunities, and it's. I mean, ultimately, I'd like to see it used in the same way, or as close as possible to the same way that conventional mass timber is used. Multi-story buildings at scale, all the sectors that we're seeing particularly gaining traction with, education, residential, and so on. I think to begin with, there's lots of other smaller scale applications that make sense. The Demonstrator project that we did last year looked at a sort of volumetric modular structure. That's not our sort of main target, but I think there is a potential market there in producing volumetric buildings that you can drop onto sites. But yeah, lots of other potential uses which the others might want to come in on.
Or Julia, do you want to go first, or
you go ahead, Jonas. You can. Yeah.
Because I compared to traditional CLT, I think CLT made from reclaimed timber has 2 beautiful stories, and that's the history of the material you use. It's a product. In our example, we're going to probably speak about it later. We've harvested in central London some beautiful old kind of different pieces. They were there probably for 100-200 years, that's what we guess, and have been growing before that probably for 100 years. So it's just 300 years in total of history that you take and you manufacture it to something which, when it's then locally used, it even kind of gives a kind of tangible source where it comes from. I'm not saying that's not the case for Scandinavian spruce. That's also kind of, or wherever it comes from, but it's kind of, it was in a building, somebody has already kind of manufactured it. It has a story to tell, and I think to continue this history or this story by reusing it is a beautiful kind of thing on add-on that we can kind of contribute. Sorry, did you?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, as you were speaking, yeah. I'm envisioning, and I'm referencing some projects in my local hometown where they redeveloped kind of a block of an old existing brick building, but they reused a lot of the material and also kept part of the structure when they built this big fancy hotel on top of it. I'm envisioning, hey, this building is coming down for whatever reason. That's why you guys are getting the materials, right? The story is, hey, what the components that you pull out of this you're keeping that history, you're keeping it there, you're reusing it to replace that same building. I think that would be like a wonderful story to see come to fruition. And I'll pivot back to you because I know I cut you off.
No, it's exactly that.
Can I just pop in as well? And because a lot of the time when you reuse building materials or whole buildings, it's also aesthetically pleasing to see that history show, and that is something that we actually really noticed in the volumetric module that Colin was talking about, is that it's got a lot of character. It's kind of got more personality. You could produce cross-laminated secondary timber with whatever surface you want, and it can look brand new, obviously. But it is kind of nice to see some of that history of use in the material, as well as there's an aesthetic benefit, I think. Jonas, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
No. For my own personal use, so my partner Nick and I, like the entire reason we got into mass timber is we were trying to use it for our own multifamily developments. And this was several years ago before it was kind of in the conversation for that smaller scale use. But in my mind, it's like, I love the beautiful, clean, virgin panel look, but I've always talked with my wife specifically. She's like, how can you distress it to make it look, different, give it some character? And I was like, well, you don't even have to do that. You could just use the reclaimed materials to do that. So that's nice.
Absolutely, it's basically it's exactly the point I was saying. The surface, the texture as well. So we have pictures. It's hard to in a picture to really show. It's obviously more beautiful in real life, and whenever you're in the UK, we look forward to show it to you, the products. But it's all the same. It's all softwood, but it's kind of due to different age and different kind of history, it kind of gives a quite unique texture and also surface coloring kind of, which I think is beautiful, and as Julia said, combined with the eventual kind of manufacture or kind of like machining signs or old signs that have been added with the axis, and like back in the days when they numbered the pieces with this kind of old technique, to include this into a panel, that would just be I think a really beautiful thing.
And a little bit farther back in the conversation, you had referenced a project or a study that you wanted to talk about. Can we unpack that?
Are you talking about the DTU? Yeah, I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This, so this began as a funding from one of the UK research councils given to UCL for UCL then to give out to researchers who are looking at ways to not do new pieces of research, but take the research already completed and apply it in the context of a real industrial sponsor who could then adopt that research and put it into practice. So we were partnering with Porter Cabin, who are a market leader in Europe for off-site modular construction, and they were interested in whether you could make one of their typical Porter Cabin modules, but do it out of timber, and not only do it out of timber, but do it out of reused timber. So we were looking at their typical design and trying to translate that into something that we were able to manufacture using both cross-laminated secondary timber and glue-laminated secondary timber. So we made a glue-lam ST frame, if you will, and then clad that with CLST, cross-laminated secondary timber, wall panels, and had a CLST floor, timber cassette roof panels with plywood that we salvaged from the production process and more secondary timber. And we manufactured basically 1/3 of their typical Porter Cabin module. So it's when you cut a section through one of these modules, it's a small building, but it's kind of acts as a stage. So we then exhibited it firstly as part of the UCL Festival of Engineering, in the place where we manufactured it in the Olympic Park in a place called Here East. And then in Bloomsbury in central London at UCL Central Campus. And then a couple of months later, it went to the London Design Festival, to a really prominent site behind, just on South Bank. And that took the pilot to a much bigger audience. It became known as Cascade Up, and we can share some images of that. What were the lessons from that? What did we do, Ennis?
Yeah, what was the reception from the people that saw it? Like, did you learn anything that you weren't expecting, or was it all kind of like right in line with where you guys thought it would go?
Unsurprisingly, nobody really disliked it. I would have been surprised if somebody was there. It wouldn't be kind of like, wow, it's nice. And it was kind of a really beautiful think Colin mentioned it being a stage of kind of speak about the story of reusing material, and not just timber, but materials in general. I think to have a dialogue or a conversation on reusing materials, that natural resources are not endless, and there is a lot of very valuable material around there which can be used, reused, and reused in a really aesthetic, obviously, and biased way, because a lot of the reactions, I don't know if you and Colin and Julia, you agree, but a lot of the reactions was, oh, wow, that's reclaimed timber, that looks like new.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it looks like new, but it's actually, as we've said, material that has been reclaimed from demolition sites, reused, and I think that kind of idea that something that is reused, Julia, also you mentioned it in the preparation, teach people that, or to let people know that materials, reused materials, don't necessarily have to be kind of like this vintage downgrading.
They don't have to look vintage, right?
Yeah,
They don't have to serve
exactly.
that
They
purpose. Yeah.
can be really kind of like proper good quality materials. I think that's a wow effect which I quite enjoyed. Yeah,
It's interesting because Portakabin's a very different thing to the sort of, we're talking about a kind of aesthetic of reuse before, and like the stories of materials. Portakabin's very much an off-the-shelf kind of product. So they're probably not our ideal customer, and probably they're not going to be buying our stuff en masse. But the I think they're both interesting aspects of it. Like, how much can you standardize and make and develop as a not just volumetric modular, but a modular component that's very so a smaller scale type of mass timber, where it goes together in this kit of parts, and it doesn't rely on, it's very much like looks like normal CLT, but it's in smaller pieces. It sort of enables more adaptability of buildings through their life cycle. That was one of the things that we were trying to investigate through that project. So that's one angle that differentiates it from normal mass timber, and then the other is this sort of aesthetic potential to use the weathered surfaces of timber. And I think people, those events were great because we were exposed to a lot of other other people from academia, but lots of industry, lots of public engagement, particularly at the London Design Festival, and also policymakers coming in, having being provoked by what we were doing to say, okay, maybe these sort of circular economy opportunities are closer to being implemented than we thought, and maybe we're trying to get we're partly using the case of UK CLT to say how far off real are these types of circular businesses, and what do you need to do as policymakers or as people deciding what sort of infrastructure we need in the future. How little do you have to do to make this become real?
What have you guys identified as some of the, I'm sure there's many, but kind of like the key obstacles or challenges that you're hoping to address to encourage more, circular businesses like yourselves? I heard you talk about, the policy sector, talking about public buy-in, talking about end use cases, and insurance is probably a big one, especially being over in the UK with mass timber in general. Like, what are you guys focused
on? You're right. There are many. We don't see any of them as insurmountable. And I think some of those challenges around mass timber in the UK at the moment are not specifically issues for secondary timber. Maybe they become. There's another element of the fire performance question that, how similar is secondary timber to primary? But our working assumption is that it would be the same. It obviously needs more investigation. I think as Jonas was saying earlier, not so much the mechanical performance of the material, but the confidence in the mechanical performance through having a grading system that works for secondary timber. That's a big one. But then as a business, I think it's how you go from this kind of small scale production, one-offs, into doing it in a at scale, in a repeated industrialized way. And they're the kind of, we're looking for the right stepping stones to take us forward in that to that sort of destination of being able to do it at scale.
I think there's also a challenge for us coming from sort of an academic background into the commercial world. And I think somebody alluded earlier on to a project that we have that's funded by Horizon Europe, in which we're doing a case study for cross-laminated secondary timber, where we're applying something called the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources, which is part of the United Nations Resource Management System, which is a 12 principles to manage resources in a way that support the Sustainable Development Goals. And the framework classification is a tool to communicate with investors and other stakeholders about the commercial viability and sustainability of resource recovery projects. So because, this is kind of our first time developing a business from scratch, so we're developing the business plan and also looking at all of the aspects of what makes a CLST business sustainable for economically and environmentally and also socially. So I think by having this Horizon Europe project, it's helping us really flesh out what it is that we need to do to address the challenges to make this a commercial reality and deal and communicate with our stakeholders.
So we talked about, Jonas talked about the story behind it. We talked about the aesthetic behind it. We talked about, the sustainability aspect behind it. When you guys are communicating to the end purchaser, the end user of these types of product, are there certain questions or objections that they have that you find being like a common thread that you're like, hey, the secondary CLT, it fits this bucket. Like this is for you.
I think it's the opposite of that. I think it's pushing on an open door. Everyone is amazing and really wants to see this go. And so I think it's the practical challenges of just making it go fast enough, I think, that we're facing.
If somebody were listening, so there's a lot of people from different backgrounds, professionally, geographically, et cetera, that listen to this. What is something that you guys could ask or get help from the mass timber community on? Is there certain challenges, people you need to talk to, resources you're trying to get a hold of, data, et cetera? Like, what would really help you guys?
Mm-hmm. I have one point and looking forward for additional points from Colin and Julia. But one point I think we could benefit from while working with reused timber is data and experience from other great organizations and initiatives, projects, networks, work with secondary timber. And I think there's some great stuff happening in Norway, in the US, in Germany, in France, even in the UK, in Scotland, not to forget. And I think there is a lot of experience now kind of piling up, but sometimes the kind of like dial or the exchange of knowledge is not super easy. So I think kind of learning from each other would be a point for me to mention here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I think you're right. There's a need for everyone working with secondary timber to gather data in a way that's aggregatable and means that we start to build a big enough data sets for everyone to gain in confidence in it. I think there's also academics at Edinburgh Napier have pointed this out before. There's a similarity with secondary timber and using less frequently used sort of local species in mass timber, where there isn't sort of established grading rules, and those have to be put together to enable local species to go into CLT. So that's possibly an area. I mean, I think there's a question about whether UK CLT and other small startups trying to do similar things in other countries continue to do what they're doing independently as small scale startups and growing like that, as opposed to partnering with existing large scale mass timber producers. And at this point, I think we're their business model is so much focused on where the forests are, and as we've talked about, the UK is not that, so it doesn't especially make sense. But I think we're seeing increasing interest in urban sawmills and those secondary stocks. So it's how those new bits of infrastructure to enable this other potential feedstock for mass timber to go into to be capitalized upon. What's the best mechanism for that to happen? I'd like UK CLT to grow independently, but we shall see.
But I think also, I mean, one of the challenges often in the circular economy is is for organizations of different scales to work together. So, you've got this really quite large by now mass timber industry using primary sources. And, if you say what we'd like from them, it would be nice if they would engage with us. It would be nice if there was sort of a continuum where there are virgin sources and secondary sources, and it's all part of the marvelous picture of construction with a new renewable, sustainable resource. And I think that's hard because, they're focused on their forests and their core business plan, and to deal with a small startup, I think, is hard. So, but we would really welcome engagement from these bigger companies to help us understand where, in fact, we can fit into the marketplace in a way that is helpful for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sorry, just to add on this one, I think that's that's an very important point. And also upstream kind of material supply. We had some great contacts with very motivated demolition contractors supplying feedstock. And I completely understand it's something new. You wouldn't probably be used to kind of be open to change maybe some kind of very well established processes, in particular in a high price environment such as London, where you have very much just in time removal of construction demolition waste, for example. I think a good collaboration with upstream material supply organizations is really important, because one other lesson we learned is the quality of the feedstock we get into the process has a dramatic impact in kind of all kind of manufacturing and that processing that happens. in kind of our environment, or in our kind of mill, let's say, and therefore this collaboration is pretty critical as well. So
well,
happy. Yeah.
I'm excited to see what you guys do with this secondary CLT stuff. Like I reached out to you guys because I was like, wow, this is awesome. I love what they're doing here. What are you guys working on next? Like, what's the next big thing that you guys are moving towards?
Well, it would be great to get a larger scale demonstrator project where we can not just test the sort of putting the stuff together at a building scale, but go through more of the inevitable hoops that you have to go through, working with all members of a design team, contractors, insurers, to get a thing built and signed off. So we want to see practical application, but at the same time we intend to continue on a research basis. So after the Horizon project that Julia mentioned earlier, we'd like to we're hoping to secure a grant for a much larger piece of work focused on all the different challenges that we need to support the commercialization. I think, well, another thing we're interested in is exactly how we go about the factory. Like, what does the factory look like? Is it a case of the sort of single large scale place of production, or is there more of a small scale, maybe a flying factory that can arrive at sites, process timber there or close to where waste's emerging, and then supply it back to do some level of the production there, whether that's all the way through to CLT, or doing something that you can do without so much processing, like nail laminated or down laminated timber. And maybe that's a way that it can scale up in a more sort of piecemeal, or piece by piece, and then many flying factories can then be operating in different localities, because it's all about relocalizing supply chains on one level.
So before I ask my last question, how can people get in contact with you guys and learn more about what you're doing?
UKCLT.com.
All right. And then I know I've seen you on LinkedIn, Colin, Julia, Jonas. Are you guys on LinkedIn too? It's kind of where the mass timber industry lives online, I found. Okay. I'll link the website, and I'll link you guys down below for your profiles down there.
I just want to say a few words about I showed a picture, which we can send you. But the picture is just kind of a fun thing that happened when we had the Festival of Engineering, where we had groups of school children come around, and they were very keen to jump up and down on the demonstrator to test its structural soundness. And I don't know if that's going to be enough for the insurance industry, but
it may require a little bit more testing, but it passes in my book.
But it was a big relief for us when we did the preparation and I'm mentioning to select. Okay, it's good, it's safe.
Okay, last question. I know there's three of you, and usually we do this with one guest, but you've got somebody in an elevator for 30 seconds. What are you telling them about what you do, your mission, and where you're hoping to take it?
Oh, I don't know. I think personally, because I've come from the waste management side, I'm very keen on people recognizing the value of secondary resources, and that they need to be integrated into our buildings and our structures for better sustainability, essentially, and that I'm hoping that there'll be more acceptance so that we can develop the systems that will allow that to happen.
Beautiful.
I can go next. I just recently had this conversation, and I had it actually with my partner, with my wife, and she was like, "Yeah, timber. I don't know. It burns, right? And I don't know whether." And I was like, That's exactly the point. I think it was mentioned before. I see our contribution not as kind of competition with primary timber industry. It's just another thing on top of a beautiful industry that is growing for a good reason, and I think has so much potential. But we are also concerned with this perception that timber is just seen as a material that has lesser value than steel and concrete. And I would kind of like to change this understanding, this perception, into seeing timber as a construction material that has so much potential and so much value, and a kind of
Yes, sir. I agree.
Future.
I agree. And then what do you want to close with, Colin?
Well, UKCLT, we're one of a number of companies trying to lead this movement away from the linear economy and into circular economy. And we think there's great opportunity with timber, but we want people to look again at all things that they're currently discarding and see not a problem of waste, but an opportunity.
That's great. Well, thanks for sharing what you guys are doing. I'm going to link all those resources that we talked about down below. I encourage people to reach out, talk to you guys about what you're doing, see how they can get involved, see if we can boost up the secondary CLT use, specifically in the UK, of course, but I would love to see something like that take off a little bit more here in North America, selfishly. So thanks for joining me, guys. I really had a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Brady. It was really great to meet you.
Yes, absolutely.